Welcome to the podcast about venture capital, where investors and founders alike can learn how VCs make decisions and reach conviction. Your host is Nick Moran, and this is The Full Ratchet.
Brad Feld joins us today from Boulder, Colorado. For those that don't know Brad is one of the most prolific investors and bloggers in early stage venture. He's a co-founder of both Techstars and Foundry Group, where he currently serves as a partner. Brad has also authored many books about early stage investing, with the most recent being Startup Boards, a field guide to building and leading an effective board of directors. Brad, this is a true pleasure. Welcome to the show.
My pleasure to be here.
Can you give us a 2 to 3 minute background of yourself and your path to venture?
Sure. I'm a partner at a venture fund called Foundry. We are 6 partners. We've got about $4 billion under management. We invest 75% of our money directly in early stage companies, typically at the Series A. The other 25% of our capital we invest in early stage venture funds as an LP. We have about just a little bit under 50 that we're investors in, that we essentially have partnerships with. I'm also a co-founder at Techstars, which I'm on the board of, and Foundry and my partners are very involved in lots of different ways, and we've got a lot of capital allocated to different aspects of the Techstars funds. I started a company while I was in college. I sold it 7 years later to a public company, never raised any outside capital. That company was very acquisitive, so I was on their deal team and learned how to do acquisitions by basically just being involved. I also had never made any investments, so I took most of the money that I made from selling that first company, and between 1994 and 96 made 40 angel investments, usually $25,000, $50,000 checks, and then sort of accidentally became a VC in 1996, 1997.
How accidentally? How does one accidentally become a VC?
Extremely accidentally. So I was making angel investments with my own money. It was the rise of the commercial internet. I was living in Boston, which is where my first company was. I had made investments in a handful of reasonably high profile, or had become quickly high profile, new internet companies on both the East Coast and the West Coast, because I traveled a lot. And my wife, Amy, and I moved to Colorado randomly. We just decided we were going to try Boulder, and if we liked it, we'd stay. And if we didn't, we'd go try something else. We loved Boulder, and that's where we stayed. I knew a VC in Boston who had been involved in, or was involved in, this Japanese company called SoftBank that at the time nobody knew anything about, had just started to buy companies in the US and was starting to invest money in this thing that was called digital media, which became the internet. And through him, got connected into SoftBank, and with sort of a small group, a couple of people that SoftBank hired, and then a couple of affiliates of SoftBank, which included a couple of people that are really well known, Fred Wilson, now a partner at USV, and Jerry Colonna, who runs a firm called Reboot, and then a fourth guy, Rich Levendov, who's a longtime friend. The 4 of us were affiliates, so we basically got to continue to do our own investing, but we brought deals to SoftBank. In 1997, maybe, or early 97, SoftBank effectively ran out of money. And when that happened, a group of the 4 of us, me and 3 of the SoftBank people, started a firm that initially was called SoftBank Technology Ventures that SoftBank sponsored. Had a long, twisty road, and eventually became called Mobius Venture Capital. And while SoftBank was our sponsor, we owned the firm, so it was really our firm. And I woke up one day and I was, partners with these 3 other guys doing venture, which was not the plan. That's how accidental it is.
Awesome. Okay. Well, everyone knows that you're a prolific blogger. I've read countless of your posts, and you have a number of podcast episodes out there about your background, your investing principles. So we're not going to do that today. We're going to talk about...
I'm so bored of that.
We're going to talk about the recent book. I'm going to try to make the conversation about the book also not boring, because I know you've had a couple podcasts on the book as well. We're going to have to cover some of the basics, but my hope is that we're going to cover some of the areas you haven't touched on yet too. So for those that haven't read Startup Boards, the second edition, which recently came out, can you describe to the audience what the book is about, what the inspiration was behind writing it?
Sure. The book is about how board of directors work in the context of startups. So not aimed at public company boards and big boards, but for startups, and how a board can be helpful to a startup or hurtful to a startup, how to think about roles of board members, the dynamics of sort of the functional interaction between and amongst the team that is the board, formal and informal responsibilities. And then a lot of stuff about building a board, how to think about the board from a CEO's perspective. And then the other side of it, if you're interested in becoming a board member or you aspire to be a board member, how that works and how to end up on a board. And if you are a board member, what you should or shouldn't be doing. The inspiration for it was the first edition came out in 2013. I'd been writing at that point a couple of books that were startup related. I'd written a book called Startup Communities, which had the hypothesis that you can build and need to build a startup community basically in every major city in the world, and that entrepreneurship would be democratized. I wrote a book with my wife, Amy Batchelor, called Startup Life, which was, I think the subtitle was Surviving and Thriving in a Relationship with an Entrepreneur. So sort of how to think about, it's some autobiographical, but a lot just sort of general principles that we tried to live our life sort of in this entrepreneurial world that I was in with her as my partner, who also has her own work world in addition to my work world, and sort of how we played that out. And a logical book in the context of that series was around boards, which I felt, even in 2013, I've been on a handful of boards that were extraordinary. I've been on a handful of boards that were awful. The vast majority of boards I've been on have been somewhere in the average, mediocre, okay. Sometimes individual board members are extraordinary, but the collective team that's the board occasionally is extraordinary, but most of the time is not. And I felt like there was an enormous amount of both misinformation and misunderstanding, and a real lack of opportunity missed by entrepreneurs in building effective boards and using the board to help you build and scale your company.
It's one of the most comprehensive books I've read about boards, for sure. So if you're a founder, investor, highly recommend reading it. You cover a variety of important topics in the book. Is there an overarching takeaway that you want the reader to have?
Yeah. We use a quote from Jeff Lawson early that I feel really kind of says it all. And if anybody's heard a podcast of me talking about it before, I generally bring it up because it's just so well said. Jeff is the founder of Twilio, co-founder of Twilio, and he's the CEO. Twilio, I don't know what their market cap is now, but let's say it's $15, $20 billion market cap, been a very successful company. And Jeff's simple view was, as CEO, I get to build two teams. One team is my leadership team, and one team is my board of directors. In the context of my leadership team, that's pretty well understood how to build and lead a leadership team as a CEO. But what Jeff says that's so powerful, he says, look, I know the board can fire me. That's one of the responsibilities of a board. But as long as the board doesn't fire me, why not try to build the most highly effective team of really experienced people who are my board of directors to help me build and scale my business? And that's the essence of it. It's like, lots of entrepreneurs are afraid of the board, or they have mythology about how the board just fires CEOs, or boards are useless, or it's a time-consuming waste of energy. And by the way, there are plenty of boards that are. So it's not that there's mythology that's complete nonsense. But a lot of the functional activity and a lot of that tone of how effective a board is has a lot to do with the CEO and with the founders and how they build and engage with this thing called the board of directors. Mm-hmm. And so trying to help people get a full view of that and have a lot of tools for thinking about it from the perspective of founder CEO was a key goal.
I want to talk about building that board, and maybe let's start at the very beginning. So from the founding of a company, every startup has a board, even if it's just one person. How do you advise founders first on the right time to grow their board beyond just themselves and hold regular board meetings with some sort of formality?
Yeah, Matt Blumberg, who's the third co-author of the book and was co-author in the second edition, Mahendra and I wrote the first edition, Matt added on for the second edition, has something which I really like, which is his rule of ones. And in it, he says, you should build a board from day one. You should only have one founder on the board. And every time you add an investor to the board, you should add an independent director to the board. And I don't agree as strongly with him that you should only have one founder on the board, especially for very, very early stage companies. But as the business evolves and grows, I do agree with that premise that having multiple founders on the board is challenging. And frankly, there's lots of ways to address that and still have the various founders have a voice without necessarily being on the board. But it comes back to the answer to your question, which is I think you should build your board from the very beginning. and take advantage of the fact that you're going to have, again, same thing that Jeff said, you have these incredibly capable people that you attract to help you build your company and help you as a leader grow and develop. Why not take advantage of that? And the discipline of having a board and having a regular cadence for board meetings, of having accountability as a founder and as a CEO to an entity, the board, that forces a level of seriousness and rigor, especially early on, especially with regard to issues that you may or may not know what to do with, whether you're a first-time entrepreneur or CEO or a multi-time entrepreneur or CEO, the board can be really helpful for that. So I encourage entrepreneurs to build their boards from the very beginning. There is a lot of assertions in the market today, and there's been a lot of view by many that not only do you not need to build a board early, but you should delay building a board as long as you possibly can. And I think that advice is, from my frame of reference, ill-informed, but it comes from the perspective of founders and also some investors who, many of them used to be founders, who experienced very bad boards or had very ineffective boards that was sort of not helpful to them in their own growth and development. So I think one of the things to think about in the context of the answer of when you should build your board as an entrepreneur is, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish? And in some ways, really look at the things that would cause you not to build a board early on. Logical ones are, well, I don't want to lose control of my company. I don't want somebody to tell me what to do. I don't want to have to answer to anyone, right? Like those are easy. There's probably 50 more you could come up with. But sort of try to understand what those are, and then think about whether they're actually helpful to you as an entrepreneur and helpful to you and your company, or whether you're reacting or responding to something else, whether it's a fear that you have, something that you heard about happen to somebody else, conventional wisdom, which might or might not be correct, that you just hear floating around. And so sort of, again, going back to, the basics of saying, what's your goal here? And if the goal of the board is to have another highly functional team that helps you build your business, well, that's responsibility that you as the CEO need to take or have the opportunity to take on. And you can decide not to. But if you decide to take it on, you should take it on seriously.
So aside from not building a board and keeping it just the founder, what is the biggest mistake that a founder does make when they're forming their first board? Call it sub-Series A. When they're in the infancy of the company, what are some of the common mistakes that you tell founders to look out for?
Yeah, there's a simple quick hit list. One is you just put all your co-founders on the board. So the board is just the same group of people sitting around co-founding the company. The next is you view the board as a control mechanism for the business. And so you try to control the board through who's on it, number of board seats. I think there's a lot of anthropomorphizing of boards. The board's a team. It's not an individual thing called the board. And yeah, it has a function and has formal legal responsibilities, but it's a collection of individuals functioning as a team. I think a very common mistake is not to look at it as a team and just look at it as a collection of individuals, or again, anthropomorphize it into an entity, which it's not. Another is to not be thoughtful about board construction. This is a different flavor of just adding all the founders to the board, but adding your friends or adding somebody that you know, or not being really thoughtful about who are the 2 or 3 or 4 people I want to add to the mix here at this stage of the game. Those are some quick, easy, common mistakes.
I think most founders are probably, somewhere in between their board being very effective and it being, horribly ineffective, right? They're somewhere in between. They might have some fear of their board. And you noted this, but CEOs spend so much time developing their management team, but they don't do the same with their board. There's almost like a misalignment, or there's a miscategorization, if you will. What steps do you recommend founders to take the current state of that board to get more aligned and start treating them like a team, get them all rowing in the same direction rather than this veneer between the two?
I think, if you have a board already, it's set expectations around what you want from the board. Be clear about how you want the board to interact with you and with the leadership team, not by dictating, here's what I want you to do, but by forming, a consensus agreement, discussing it. If you have a lead director or a chair or a particularly, significant board member who has a lot of impact on, what's going on, work with that person to define effective rules of engagement for the whole team that's the board. all the same socialization activities that you do with the leadership team, especially in today's post-COVID world with the world of remote work or hybrid work, like understanding how to do things to build relationships between the participants so that there's a functional intersection of activity between everyone. Being clear about what you want the characteristics of board members to be. And if you find yourself with a board that doesn't have different characteristics represented, putting some effort into changing membership or the participation on the board to incorporate those characteristics, regardless of what they are. So, a series of things that you need to work through. I feel like it's kind of generic what I'm saying. It's, build a team. Do the stuff that you have to do, whatever kind of team you're building. Anyone who's ever been a leader knows that if you just have a collection of people and you spend no time working on the team dynamics of that team and building the relationships and setting expectations, you're going to have a shitty team. It's not going to be terribly effective. You might have some superstars, but you're not going to have a thing that works well together.
Yeah. It's definitely what you're putting in is what you're going to get out of it, right? Like if you're dedicating no time, no attention or effort into developing, cultivating those relationships and conveying expectations, you're going to get very little out of it if you're a founder.
That's right.
How do you define a highly functioning board though? I mean, you alluded to this earlier, but you've probably been on 200 boards-ish, somewhere in that range?
Oh, I don't know the number. It's a big number.
It's a big number. Of the boards you've seen run the most effectively, though, what are the characteristics of a high-functioning board?
The moments in time that the board actually makes a difference is when a company is in distress, when there's transactional activity happening, when there's exogenous things going on that could potentially really impact the company positively or negative, and when there's leadership transitions. There's probably a couple of other, bullet points that you could put in that mix, but, those kinds of moments. So much of the rest of the time that the board is interacting, it's preparing itself to be effective in a moment like that. As an individual board member, I have a mantra, which is, as long as I support the CEO, my job is to do whatever I can do to help her be successful. If I get to a place where I don't support her, it's my job to do something about it, which doesn't mean fire her, but try to get back to a place where I support her. And ultimately, if I can't get back to the place, as a board member, I'm part of an organization, the board, that can replace and recruit a new CEO. So I can always choose to go down that path if I want to, although not 100% of the time, because there's definitely situations where companies are configured in a way where the board actually can't replace the CEO. And that's notable. It's the rare exception, but it exists. But if I use that frame of reference for me individually, every CEO I've ever worked with needs different stuff. And as a result, every board that I've ever worked with needs to operate in different ways depending on what the CEO needs and what the context is. Mm-hmm. And I think the really well-functioning boards have awareness of that. And when they really need to engage around an issue, whether it's a negative or a positive, but that's one that goes beyond just what the CEO can do, the highly functional boards work really well to get to an answer and an outcome. And the ones that are not, there tends to be a lot of thrash, a lot of conflict, a lot of second guessing, a lot of undermining. By the way, highly functioning boards have lots of debate, plenty of arguments, lots of disagreement, but ultimately it's in the search of an answer. It's in the search of a decision. Whereas organizations that are not functional or, teams that are not functional struggle to get to that decision point.
Mm-hmm. Out of all the boards that you've been on, can you name a few companies or a few boards that stick out as being some of your favorites and the ones that you enjoyed the most?
One from a long time ago, I think that was a really effective board, was the Zynga board. It was a small board, but it was one that was very engaged and very active in supporting Mark Pincus, who was the CEO, but helping Mark think through things in an extraordinarily dynamic environment, very fast changing and with extreme growth. So I feel like that team, which was at the time, the board was, when I was on it, was me, Mark, Reid Hoffman, and Bing Gordon. We each brought something different to the board, but the way we interacted with each other around issues and around the rest of the team worked really well. I think another board that I was on for a period of time that I would consider to be highly effective was the SendGrid board after a CEO transition. So SendGrid as a company sort of got to a certain level, meaningful size business, maybe $40 million or something like that. but was starting to have some challenges. Growth was slowing. There was some vibrations and different things. And the board ultimately decided to make a leadership change. I had not been on the board. I joined the board just shortly before the leadership change. We recruited in a new CEO, Samir Dalokia, who did an extraordinary job of both leading the company and then building the company forward. It ultimately went public and then got bought by Twilio for a couple $1 billion. But the period of time that Samir took over running the company was very, very bumpy. When I look back, with the benefit of a lot of hindsight, I think a year after he joined, there was only one person from the leadership team that was on the leadership team at the company when he joined that was still at the company a year later.
Wow, okay.
And that was the general counsel. So the whole leadership team, for various reasons, including some of them who were very unhappy that the prior CEO had been replaced, turned over. But it was a period of time where I think the board was very focused in being helpful and supportive to Samir and to the team that was there and the team that was evolving and developing as they had a really good business and found their footing and took it to the next level. And it functioned really well during that period of time. There's a couple of examples.
Were you an independent or were you an investor?
No, Foundry was a large investor. I joined the board. We move boards around at Foundry periodically. And I would say that times that we move boards around tend to be a function of partner load or in some cases, just lack of a better phrase, partner fatigue. I can think of a situation, I'll use a case from a different version. I was on the board of two companies that an entrepreneur who I'd worked with for many, many years, going back to one of my first angel investment, a guy named Raj Bhargava. He's now running a company called JumpCloud. And Raj was chair of a company that was struggling, this company called Mobile Day, which ultimately failed. And then he was also CEO of a company which he had co-founded that evolved and turned into JumpCloud. And I was on those boards, but I was also on a bunch of other boards. And I was just tired. I mean, I had too much going on. I had a couple of pretty intense things happening on a few of the boards. And my partner, Seth, basically just one day, he knew he was stretched and he had some capacity. He said, look, I'll take over. He knew Raj and they had a good relationship. He says, I'll take over these two that Raj is involved in. And I know that, Mobile Day, whatever, I'll see that to its end. And for JumpCloud, it's still very, very early, but I'll work with Raj and we'll try to figure out where it goes. And, that would be an example of us sort of looking out for each other as partners. And, Seth and Raj did an extraordinary job, worked well together. JumpCloud, now is a very large, I think there are almost 1,000 people, very, very successful directory as a service business. And, it was totally fine for me to step off the board. I could continue. I still have a relationship with Raj. I still help with the company, but I just didn't have the responsibility of it on top of other things. In the case of SendGrid, my partner, Ryan McIntyre, was on that board. And I think he had just hit a point with the company where he was tired. It had been stressful dealing with the CEO transition. There's a lot of things that were going on that were not necessarily, easy to get through. Some of them were self-inflicted, whatever. He went on a sabbatical for about a month and I stepped into the board seat while he was on sabbatical. And when he came back, he said, gosh, it was so nice to go away for a month and not think about, SendGrid every day. I said, you stay away. When you're ready to come back, tell me and I'll give you the board seat back. Anytime you want it, take it. But don't feel like you need to take it. And a year later, he said, okay, I'd love to be back involved. And
you're like too late. You're like, I'm good.
No. Because, our strategy as a venture firm is always to look at the whole portfolio as one rather than this is my deal, this is your deal.
Yeah, I love that.
We're all equal partners. The economics are the equal. There's no incentive or motivation to be on one versus the other. So it's really, how can we be most effective as a team? And those would be good examples of it. So, for me, it was a delight to hand the board back to him in a moment in time where he could say, all right, I have energy for this again. I really love the company. And it's, a lot of the stuff I was struggling with that was wearing me out is in the past. And let's go forward. And there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. As your board experience has accrued over the years, if you could rewind the clock and give your younger self, being a board member, one piece of advice, what would that be? Don't
tell people what to do. I think I'm mostly good at not doing that anymore. Every now and then, I'm sure it comes out in a way where some of the people in the room are interpreting what I'm saying. Instead of hearing it as data or hypotheses or suggestions, they're hearing it as things to do. I try really, really hard not to tell anybody what to do in the context of being a board member. Sometimes, especially if it's a new relationship, I try to be really clear about here's my hypothesis. Here's how I think about it. Or here's just some data. Throw it away if you disagree. But I try to work for the CEO. I try to be a part of the team rather than be telling the team what to do. And when I was younger, I was chair or vice chair of a number of companies. I will never do that again because people interpret the chair as having a different kind of authority, which it does. The chair does. Sorry, not vice chair, but co-chair. So I'd have there'd be two chairs. And I just don't want that because I don't want the extra authority. And I don't want people to hear, oh, well, Brad wants this to happen, therefore I must go do this to happen. A quick funny story that demonstrates that. I was co-chair of a company that was a public company called Interliant. We bought a bunch of web hosting companies, and then we became a thing called an application service provider, which was the precursor to SaaS. This is in the late 90s. And generally when we bought a company, I'd go visit the company after we bought it, sometimes before, but there was a deal team and, I was traveling all over the place, but I tried pretty hard to go visit the companies after we bought them. And I was with a CEO. We just bought their company. We were really excited about the company. It was a not huge business, maybe $5 million, but they were profitable and the entrepreneur is totally self-funded. And, you get to the offices and part of the reason that the company was doing well was that they just spent no money on extra stuff. And, the offices were, I would say, appropriately startup shabby, but they were pretty shabby, even on a relative basis. And we were just walking down the hall and I was tired. I'd probably taken a red eye or I'd whatever. And I was, cheerful and in a happy mood, but I made some offhanded comment without really thinking about it. And the offhanded comment, as I'm walking down the hall with the founder of this company, I said, man, that wall could use a coat of paint. And I meant it as a compliment. Like I kind of meant it as good thing that you're not, he didn't hear it that way, right? But like that, what was in my tired brain was, oh, they're not wasting money on fancy offices. That was what was in my tired brain. I could have said, I'm really proud of you for not wasting money on fancy offices. That's a good thing. But I said, oh, that wall could use a coat of paint. Next day, I was there for 2 or 3 days. Next day, I'm there, and there's somebody painting the wall.
At least the trust is there.
Yeah, I didn't remember the day before. Like, too much was going on at this time. I said, does he? Why are you painting the wall? He says, well, you told me that it was shabby. You told me the wall needed some paint or something. And I'm like, oh, no, I didn't mean that. Like, of course that's what he heard. Of course that's what came out of my mouth. Like, so I try not to do that because sometimes I'm right, but a lot of times I'm wrong. And my observation and my data as a board member is something that the person running the company, the CEO, ultimately needs to make the decision about, not me.
Mm-hmm. Was there a seminal moment? I know you gave this story, but I'm sure that this learning came from some reflection, or what was the inflection point where you took a step back and you said, okay, like as a board member, I need to reconfigure the way that I'm delivering feedback to founders where it's not as prescriptive, but giving them the crumbs and seeing if they're able to put the pieces together.
Yeah. And I just make one comment. I don't think I give people the crumbs. I give pretty direct data. And a lot of times I'll serve the data up on the plate, but it's still there just to decide whether to eat or not. I think it evolved over time. I think I just became more comfortable and more aware of the importance of, as the person not in the CEO seat, engaging in the conversation, but not telling people what to do. And as I got more comfortable with that and better at it, and, saw the mistakes I made when I wasn't doing a good job, because there's lots of examples when I look back over the last 30 years where I'm like, man, I did a shitty job there, or whatever I decided to do was really unhelpful, and knowing that I'll still make mistakes because that's part of the nature of the beast, but that I could do a better job. And part of doing a better job was being really clear that I was providing suggestions, hypotheses, data, not demands or making assertions or stating truth. I had once somebody say to me, I need to push back on you because, I need to show that I can tell truth to power. And I said, I don't know if I'm power. Yeah, that's up to you to decide. But I'm definitely not the source of truth, even if I'm power. So I'm glad you're telling me the truth because I don't know the truth to a lot of things. I just have ideas.
How do you go about building trust as a board, both with the founders and then also with other board members, giving them a safe space to be critical and give real feedback and try to put egos aside? So collectively, you're all rowing in the same direction, solving hard problems together. I'd just be curious to hear what you've learned on that end, because I've just started becoming a board member and I've noticed everyone likes to have an opinion on boards. And sometimes it causes, the real meat of the issues not to be addressed. So would love to hear any advice you have on just building that environment to have a safe space where egos can be put aside.
Yeah, I think trust comes from lots of different places. And again, it depends on the personalities involved and the way the interactions unfold. From my frame of reference, trust happens over time, but people have different approaches to it. I'm extremely quick to extend trust. And so kind of my default mode is to be trusting and to assume that the other person is trusting me. And I only withdraw trust when there's deceit. I don't withdraw trust when things don't work or when you have disagreements or you argue about things, but when there's deceit. So I have a pretty good, my own version of processing. A lot of people are very different than that. And there's ranges of difference. The sort of other example would be the person who's very slow to extend trust. And the only way that they build trust is through shared experiences where the other person does things that earns their trust. I think it's important to know, or at least have a sense of the personalities around the board table. One of the things I think that comes out of that dynamic is what happens when different board members are open with each other about how they're feeling. You know, the cliche-ish language used in our world now is emotional intelligence or EQ. And paying attention to one's EQ and paying attention to others' EQ and learning how to relate to each other is the way that you build trust in the boardroom. It's not, silly trust building exercises where everybody goes for a retreat for a day and falls into each other's arms and stuff like that. I mean, those things are probably not hurtful, but they're not the thing. The thing is working on stuff together and understanding how the other people that you're interacting with internalize conflict, how they react to disagreement, how they behave when disappointed. What those negative things tend to build trust if you understand how the other person engages. All the good stuff, when things are going great and everything's working and everybody's happy, that's kind of a default mode. Like you start with a situation where it's like, yeah, everything's great until it's not. And that's when the trust gets built up, when things aren't great and people have to actually show up and engage and interact and solve problems together.
Do you encourage founders to call out perfunctory board members?
I would say I am call outs. The thing I'm slowing down on and answering is call out. I encourage founders to address the issue. It's hard depending on who the board member is and what role that board member is playing. So if it's a co-founder, it's different than if it's an independent director. And that's different again if it's a venture investor, especially if that venture investor is entitled to a board seat through their investment. It then also depends on what the expectations are. I mean, there are definitely board members who are like, oh, why are you calling me out on this? I didn't know that was the expectation. Mm-hmm. There's a wide range of personality types. And so somebody might be unhappy with somebody else who's doing a perfectly good job. You're just unhappy with their delivery, or you're unhappy with their style, or you might be actually unhappy with what they're saying, even though what they're saying is quite valid and important to hear. So, it's a little more nuanced than non-performing or underperforming board members, because you have to define what that actually means. Now, if a board member doesn't show up to a board meeting or shows up to every board meeting late or doesn't show up prepared, you can call out the individual or you can reset the tone for the whole team, right? Hey, board, I know everybody can read. Since y'all can read, I'm sending out the board package in advance, 3 days in advance. And since I've sent it out 3 days in advance, and since everybody can read, I'm going to presume that you've read the board package in advance of coming to the meeting. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't, please say so at least I'm aware that you haven't had time. You set an expectation like that, everyone's going to read the board package. If somebody doesn't read it for one because they couldn't or they were on vacation or whatever, and they say it, you're like, okay, got it. If 4 times in a row the person said, sorry, I was too busy to read your board package, they're not prioritizing you. They're not prioritizing your board. Something else is going on. Like you can have the conversation in the context of that expectation that was set.
Yeah. Aside from reading the board package in the pre-read, is there anything you do to prepare for board meetings? Anything that might not be so obvious?
I think there's a lot of value in being continuously engaged with the company in some way. So I would say, again, this will vary a lot depending on what the CEO wants or needs. There are some companies where, I have interactions with the CEO on a multi-time a week basis, and there are some situations where it's infrequent. But in the context of what the company needs, trying to make sure I understand where they're at, what's going on, in a more continual way than just, hi, I'm here at the board meeting. Now tell me again what you do. One of the ways to do that, and most of the companies I'm involved in, I think maybe all the companies I'm on the board of do this at this point, is instead of sending out sort of combining the financial material with the board meeting, I just get a separate monthly financial deck for every company. So at the minimum, there's a monthly touch point because the financials are going around, and the better CEOs write up, whether it's a CEO letter to go with the financials or whether it's an MD&A, or something else, or a slide deck that describes what's going on. Like, there's more material than just here's your balance sheet, income statement, cash flow statement. But the best CEOs are continually feeding the board information about what's going on in the business, good and bad. And as a result of that, the board members have multiple ways to engage versus just show up and, sit with arms crossed at a board meeting.
I could pick your brain about this for hours, but Brad, if we could have anyone on the show, who should we have and what would you like to hear them speak about?
Can we have dead people on the show?
We can try. Who comes to mind? Can't promise we'll get them.
Yeah. Well, I think Albert Einstein would be good. Who should be on the show? This is the full ratchet. Do you just interview VCs or do you interview anyone?
We'll interview founders or VCs. And we can make an exception for you.
Okay. Well, if you want a good science fiction writer, I'm going to give you 3 who are all people I know. So if you want to interest any of them, tell me. One is David Walton. I just wrote a blog today about his most recent book. He's outstanding. Elliot Pepper, who has spent a lot of time as an entrepreneur, I think would be really fun and interesting, and is also a writer. And then another longtime friend, William Hertling, who's written a number of books. I think each of them would be fun.
And if we were able to get Albert, what would you want to hear him talk about?
I would want to know how much of the mythology around how he came up with ideas is right versus how he really came up with ideas. What was really going on and how was he thinking? Was he sitting there scribbling with a notebook? Was he really daydreaming in a parallel universe as he was living life? Was it sort of random intersections of different people and different thoughts, or was it a very deliberate exploration of something over a long period of time? So I'd like that. I'd love to hear what he really thought about Murray Gell-Mann. And I'd probably want to see, if you're interviewing him, I'd want you to interview him in the middle of Times Square and see what he thought about what was going on in Times Square today.
I think if we were able to get him, we might be able to pull off the Times Square as well as the venue. It'd be great if Alan Turing could join him and give us his thoughts on where he was headed with chaos theory too.
Give them both an iPhone 14 and have them walk around for a day and tell you what they think about what's going on. Yeah,
right. And what resources have you found particularly valuable, and what would you recommend to listeners?
Well, I think today there's an overwhelming amount of content around entrepreneurship and venture capital. I think some of the best stuff is if you go back in time, pre-2010, and mine some of that. And, writers and people who had active blogs back then, Fred Wilson, who still has a very active blog today, but I'd go back and read some of his posts from, 2007, 2008, 2009. Dave Hornick, who was one of the original VC bloggers. He doesn't blog much anymore, but go back in time to some of his early posts. I think that stuff is really rich because it was before there was the VC as content provider to generate, inbound marketing, deal flow, expertise, relevance. Another fun thing, Harry Stebbings has mastered the art of the interview, on his 20-minute VC. But if you go back to some of his very early interviews, something with a number less than 200 or 300, and pick out some people who today are still known and listen to what they were saying, whatever it was 10, 15 years ago, probably 10 years ago, not 15. I don't know how long ago those were. It might have been longer than 10 years by now. I think there's some really juicy and interesting stuff there because, in 2010, 11, as we came out of the financial crisis, there started to become sort of this next wave of VC activity, which really accelerated 2012 to 2015. But the content piece of it was also part of it. Prior to 2010, the content piece was not central. It was harder to do. It was not prevalent. And as a result, the signal was much higher versus what you get today, which is just a lot of stuff. There's a lot of signal in it, but there's a lot of stuff that you have to mine to get the signal.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you know that you need to get better at, Brad?
I don't want to get better at anything. I'm very happy with the endless evolution of all the stuff that I'm involved in. So I don't think I have a goal to get better at anything in particular. That's why I sat and thought about it for a minute. I enjoy developing some level of experience on a curve to mastery over lots of different things, but I don't feel the need to have a regimen of continual self-improvement. Some of that may be that I'm just getting older, and I recognize that at some point, my time will be up. And instead of striving to get better at things, I'm much more focused on experiencing what's happening. And, I've accepted that I screw up a lot of stuff and I get plenty of things right. And that part of the experience is both of those things.
Do you think you'll practice venture until you pass?
No.
What would make you want to stop?
I don't have an answer to that.
That's fair.
But, I don't aspire to be, I'd like to live a long time. So I'm 56 and a half. I aspire to be old, where old is probably got at least an 8 in front of it or a 9 in front of it, or maybe even 3 digits. And if I make it to 94, I'm not doing venture when I'm 94.
Might not be a reliable board member at that point. And Brad, what's the best way for listeners to connect with you?
Brad@feld.com is email. That's probably best. Twitter's @bfeld, but email's probably best.
All right. Well, everyone, he is Brad Feld. And Brad, thank you again for joining us.
Nate, that was fun. Thank you.
All right, that'll wrap up today's interview. If you enjoyed the episode or a previous one, let the guest know about it. Share your thoughts on social or shoot him an email. Let him know what particularly resonated with you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that some of the smartest folks in venture are willing to take the time and share their insights with us. If you feel the same, a compliment goes a long way. Okay, that's a wrap for today. Until next time, remember to over-prepare, choose carefully, and invest confidently. Thanks so much for listening.